Star Wars Legends had more than its fair share of crazy or cheesy stuff, some of which we've covered in past videos. As a Legends-focused channel, however, we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about the greatest well of insanity in the entire Star Wars universe, the forest moon of Endor. That's right, folks, the home of those spear-wielding, hand-roasting, imperial-killing teddy bears had a lot more to it than met the eye. In many ways, it was actually one of the most dangerous places in the galaxy, home to massive Gorax and vicious Sanyusan marauders. But it was also home to plenty of silly stuff from the old expanded universe, such as flower people, a crying mountain, and much, much more. In this video, we're going to be discussing this acid trip of a moon in detail.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
First and foremost, we have a history lesson for you. As we alluded to earlier, a disproportionate amount of legend silliness was actually centered around the forest moon of Endor. This was because a lot of the material written in the expanded universe's wildest era, the 4 or so years after the release of Return of the Jedi, was based on Endor because the Ewoks appealed to kids, and kids are a profitable target audience. During this era, Lucasfilm put out a series of kids' comics, an Ewoks cartoon, and not one, but 2 movies, Caravan of Courage and Battle for Endor. The movies and cartoon are actually on Disney Plus now if you're interested, though we're going to be honest with you, they're not really worth watching. That won't stop us from covering all the crazy lore they gave us though. The forest moon of Endor, also known as the Sanctuary Moon or just the Forest Moon, was a moon of the silvery gas giant Endor, from which it takes its name. It was in the absolute middle of nowhere, on the very edge of the unknown regions. Despite this, it became home to many different species of sentience from all over the galaxy. This was because the forest moon was essentially an archetypal desert island. A whole lot of ships crashed there, and the moon's remoteness meant rescue was unlikely. So many ships crashed on the moon because the Endor system was close to a whole bunch of astronomical hazards, most notably the black hole known as Endor's Gate or the Din Pulsar. The forest moon wasn't the only world in the galaxy where a lot of ships crashed, but it was unusual in that it was pretty habitable for those willing to put in the work. Contrary to what its name might suggest, the moon wasn't completely forested either. While large swaths of the moon were covered by gargantuan trees, it also featured vast savannas, towering mountain ranges, warm seas, and burning deserts. This allowed the forest moon to support a wide variety of life, native and otherwise. The forest moon of Endor was best known as the home of the Ewoks, but it also housed several other native sentient species. These included the amphibious Gorfs, the rodent-like Teeks, the furry Yuzums, and the Duloks, the Ewoks' eternal rivals. Of these species, the Ewoks were the most widespread by far, making up 95% of the forest moon's population. Aside from the Duloks, who they engaged in constant competition with, they were content to ignore the forest moon's other native sentients, who mostly kept to themselves. There were other creatures on the moon, however, that Ewoks couldn't safely ignore. Above all things, the Ewoks feared the vicious Gorax, gigantic semi-sentient monsters that occasionally raided Ewok villages. These creatures could grow anywhere from 6 to 30 meters in height and were known to eat Ewoks or kidnap them and keep them as pets. Because of their size and immense strength, just one Gorax was enough to threaten a whole Ewok village. Fortunately for the Ewoks, the Gorax were quite rare and only lived in remote caves, with only a few dozen of them ever having been observed by Imperial and New Republic observers. When Gorax did show up, however, it meant calamity for any Ewoks in the area, and so the moon's dominant species lived in fear of these creatures. Even blasters were of limited use against the thick hides of the Gorax, meaning the Ewoks' spears and bows were virtually useless during Gorax attacks. But being the clever engineers that they were, the Ewoks had other ways to fight these village-eating monsters. Ewok tribes tended to lay traps around the paths the Gorax usually took through the forest. These included tripwires, as well as massive log traps intended to bash the creature's brains out. You might remember those traps from the Battle of Endor when the Ewoks put them to use against Imperial AT-STs. Apart from the Goraks, certain Ewok tribes were under constant threat of attack from Sanyusan marauders. The Sanyusans were a reptilian species from one of Endor's planetary neighbors, known locally for being vicious space pirates with a very limited understanding of their own stolen technology. 100 years before the Battle of Yavin, a group of them crashed on Endor and, like many others over the years, were stranded. Their leader, Terak, proclaimed himself a king, and these Sanyusans began raiding any settlements within reach, hoping to steal a ship and return to space. While on the Forest Moon, the Marauders allied with the Night Sister Tural, who was also stranded. Tural was already feared by the local Ewoks as a shape-shifting witch, but with the Marauders by her side, she became an even greater threat than the Goraks. She more than made up for her Sanyusan allies' lack of intelligence and helped coordinate their raids on Ewok villages. The Sanyusans quickly learned that there was little hope that they'd actually find a starship on the Forest Moon. They also learned that the Ewoks were less advanced than they were, and that raiding Ewok villages likely wouldn't get them any closer to the stars. They kept up with their raids anyway, however. As an Imperial scout later observed, they terrorized the Ewoks and destroyed their villages just for the fun of it. In 3 ABY, a year before the legendary Battle of Endor, there was a major battle between the Sanyusan Marauders and the Ewoks of Bright Tree Village, the same tribe that later allied with the Rebel Alliance. At the time, the Ewoks were sheltering a pair of humans, the crashed scout Noah Brickalon and 5-year-old orphan Sindel Tawani. Unlike the craft the Marauders had come to the Forest Moon aboard, Brickalon's ship largely survived its crash landing and was nearly spaceworthy again. When the Marauders learned this, they sought to capture it and escape the moon, leading to a campaign against Bright Tree Village. This attack greatly overextended the Marauders' resources, however, and the Ewoks managed to pull off a victory, defeating Tural and King Tarak with Brickalon's help. Following this battle, the moon's Sanyusan population rapidly declined and eventually died out, ending the threat posed by these interlopers. Now, we've saved the weirdest bits of Endor lore for last. A whole lot of strange creatures called the Sanctuary Moon home, many of which were rare and only lived on certain areas of the planet. Among them were the Dandelion Warriors, a flower-like semi-sentient species whose proper name we're not even going to attempt to pronounce. These meter-tall plants were both intelligent and animate, and were known to hurl sharp quills at those who trespassed in their fields. According to Ewok legend, there was also a quartet of beings on the Sanctuary Moon who had some sort of influence over the change of seasons on the world. The most prominent of these was the Sun King, who ruled over summer, with the other 3 being the Flower Queen, the Snow King, and the Leaf Queen. The Sun King was known for being way too relaxed for someone with his sort of power, and for talking in what's best described as California Valley speak. These entities all appeared in the Ewoks cartoon, but it's still a matter of debate whether the events depicted actually happened or whether the Ewoks involved were just on a hell of a spice trip. Lastly, there was Mount Sorrow. Yep, that's right, the Forest Moon had a whole sentient mountain with a face and everything. Mount Sorrow was in a constant state of depression, likely over the fact that someone decided he was a worthy addition to Star Wars lore, and he generally didn't like other sentients. His tears had healing properties, but he had high standards for who he was willing to cry for, and was known to blow those he considered unworthy off the edge of cliffs. However, while Mount Sorrow may have been a peak with standards, he didn't have much of a grasp of morality. In particular, he had no problem with attempting to kill children, as shown when he tried to blow a pair of young Ewoks off a cliff. So, that's our look at the fever dream known as the Forest Moon of Endor. But what do you think? Do you enjoy these little absurd bits of Legends lore? And would you like to hear similar stories in the future? Let us know which stories if you have some in the comment section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to catch you in the next video.